There's a film that made $370 million at the domestic box office and over $600 million worldwide. Not because it had franchise IP behind it. Spider-Man had that. Not because it had a star everyone could name. Jim Caviezel was not a household name. Not because it was easy to market. It was filmed entirely in Aramaic and Latin, ran 2 hours of graphic violence with no comic relief, and carried an R rating into the most church-going nation on earth. It should not have worked. Every spreadsheet in Hollywood said so. Every executive who looked at it said so. And when the man who directed it, an Academy Award winner, one of the most bankable names in the industry, walked into those rooms and pitched it, they did not simply say no. They said something else entirely, something he kept mostly to himself for 20 years. In January 2025, Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan and, across nearly 2.5 hours, laid out what actually happened in those rooms, who said what, and what it cost everyone involved. And the story that emerged is not quite the one most people assume. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will look at that film and at what is coming next very differently. If this is your first time here, this channel unpacks the stories that sit just beneath the version everyone agreed on, and this one has been sitting there for 22 years. Let us start with what The Passion of the Christ actually is. It is a film about the last 12 hours of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. It opens in the Garden of Gethsemane and ends at the tomb. It depicts the arrest, the trial before the Sanhedrin, the sentencing by Pontius Pilate, the scourging, and the crucifixion. The dialogue is performed in reconstructed Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. The film is subtitled, though Gibson originally intended to release it without subtitles at all, relying entirely on the images to carry the story. It was shot in Matera, Italy, on a budget of $30 million, every cent of it Gibson's own money. The screenplay was written by Gibson and Benedict Fitzgerald, drawn from the 4 canonical Gospels and from the visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, a 19th century German mystic. The cinematography was by Caleb Deschanel. The score was by John Debney. The lead was Jim Caviezel, a working actor best known for Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line. On paper, this was not a blockbuster. On paper, this was a prestige art film with a niche audience and a ceiling somewhere around 30 million domestic, if everything broke right. The numbers said so, the precedent said so, and 7 major studios looked at it and agreed. But one detail did not fit. The man pitching it was not an unknown. He was Mel Gibson. He had directed Braveheart. He had won Best Director. He was earning more than $20 million per picture as an actor. He could have walked into any studio on earth with a screenplay about nearly anything, and they would have taken the meeting and probably said yes. They took the meeting, they did not say yes. Now, to understand why, you need to understand the timeline. Because the story most people remember, that the film was too violent, too religious, too foreign language, is the story that got told afterward. Gibson told Rogan that the reality inside those rooms was different. He described an opposition that went beyond commercial caution. He told Rogan there was genuine resistance to the subject matter itself, not to the execution, not to the risk profile, to what the film was about. Gibson told Rogan that the opposition was significant. His exact words on the podcast were plain. There was a lot of opposition to it. He said, "I think if you ever hit on that subject matter, you're going to get people going because, of course, it's a big subject matter." Think about how strange that really is for a second. This is a Best Director winner with a track record of commercial hits, walking into rooms full of people whose job it is to say yes to profitable ideas, and being told no, not by one studio, by 7. 20th Century Fox passed, Columbia passed, MGM passed, Paramount passed, Universal passed, Walt Disney Pictures passed, Warner Brothers passed, every single major. Gibson himself would later describe the film as one about something nobody wants to touch, shot in 2 dead languages. Gibson told Rogan that the stated reasons were consistent: too religious, too graphic, too foreign language, commercially unviable, and every one of those reasons was, on its own terms, defensible. An Aramaic language film about the crucifixion does not look like a tentpole. No reasonable executive would be wrong to hesitate. But Gibson told Rogan there was something beneath the stated reasons, something harder to name. He described an industry that was not merely cautious about the project, but actively uncomfortable with its premise, that a film could depict the Passion narrative without apology, without irony, without postmodern distance, and present it as a story the filmmaker genuinely believed. Gibson told Rogan he believed Christianity was the one religion it was acceptable to openly criticize in Hollywood. Rogan agreed. "Christianity is the one religion that you're allowed to disparage," Rogan said on the episode. Now, before you dismiss that as the grievance of a man who was already controversial, consider the sequence of events. This is 2002 and 2003, before Gibson's DUI arrest in 2006, before the public implosion that followed, before the years in the wilderness. At this point in the timeline, Gibson was still Mel Gibson, the star of Lethal Weapon, the director of Braveheart, one of the biggest names in the industry, and he could not get a single major studio to write the check. So he wrote it himself, $30 million, his own money, no studio safety net, no distribution deal. If the film failed, the loss was entirely his. Gibson has said he received no cash compensation for directing. He was earning $20 million per picture as an actor at the time. He took nothing for this. That alone should make you pause. And the opposition did not stop at the studios. Here is where it gets genuinely strange. Before the film had even been released, before it had been screened for critics, before a single public audience had seen it, the campaign against it was already underway. And it came from directions that most people never fully mapped. In early 2003, before filming was even complete, the Anti-Defamation League obtained what was described as an unauthorized early copy of the screenplay. In June of that year, a committee of scholars convened by the Secretariat of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, working in coordination with the ADL, reviewed the screenplay and issued a press release. Their conclusion was that the screenplay was, in their words, replete with objectionable elements that would promote anti-Semitism. That is not a small claim. And it was made about a screenplay, not a finished film. The film had not been cut, the performances had not been seen, the editorial choices that shape how an audience processes a narrative had not yet been made. The condemnation preceded the object it was condemning. Gibson told Rogan that repeated attempts were made to get him to alter the film. The ADL reached out directly. Gibson declined to engage. The ADL's national director, Abraham Foxman, warned publicly that the film would portray Jewish people in a deeply negative light. Rabbi Marvin Heer of the Simon Wiesenthal Center cautioned that the film could fuel, trigger, stimulate, induce, rationalize, legitimate anti-Semitism. In March 2004, columnist Charles Krauthammer called the film a singular act of interreligious aggression in the Washington Post. Pause on that for a moment. A single film by a single director about a story that has been depicted in art and drama for 2,000 years was being described as an act of aggression. And almost no one outside of private church screenings had actually seen it. But it goes further. Gibson's team had begun screening the film for church groups and pastors in the months before release. These were private, often invitation-only events. The audiences were overwhelmingly supportive, but critics of the film pointed out that Gibson was screening it selectively, showing it to sympathetic audiences while refusing access to journalists and advocacy groups who had raised concerns. The ADL itself acknowledged that in order to see the film before its official premiere, its representatives had to attend a screening as paid registrants to a church conference rather than as invited guests. So here's the picture by late 2003. An Academy Award-winning director has made a film about the most widely told story in Western civilization. He has paid for it himself after every major studio refused. A national advocacy organization has condemned the screenplay before the film exists in finished form. Op-eds are running in major newspapers. Scholarly panels have been convened, and not one general audience has seen the movie. Now we come to the detail that perhaps more than any other makes the story impossible to easily categorize. Because somebody had to release it. Somebody had to look at the same project that 7 studios had rejected, that major columnists were calling dangerous, that was the subject of a coordinated pressure campaign months before release, and say yes. That somebody was Newmarket Films. Newmarket was not a major. It was a small New York-based distribution company, launched in 2002. Its biggest success at that point was Whale Rider. Its president was Bob Burney. In October 2003, Newmarket signed a deal with Gibson's Icon Productions to distribute The Passion of the Christ theatrically in the United States. Icon retained ownership of all rights. Newmarket handled the marketing, the prints, and the theatrical rollout. And honestly, that's part of why the story keeps resurfacing. Because the company that said yes to the most financially successful independent film in cinema history was a small distributor most people had never heard of. The companies that said no were the 7 most powerful film studios on earth. Gibson told Rogan that Burney and his team understood the film. The strategy Newmarket devised was unlike anything the industry had seen for a faith-based release. They partnered with church networks. The National Association of Evangelicals, representing over 50 denominations and 43,000 congregations, helped sell tickets on its website. A Christian media agency called Faith Highway made promotional materials for individual churches using footage from the film. Over 400 pastors signed on in under 4 weeks. Churches across the country reserved entire theaters. Congregations were bused to screenings. And the release date was not accidental. February 25th, 2004. Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent. That detail matters more than people usually realize. Every piece of the rollout was synchronized to the liturgical calendar. The film opened not on a Friday, the industry standard, but on a Wednesday. The one Wednesday in the year when tens of millions of American Christians are already thinking about sacrifice, repentance, and the cross. The physical effects of that decision were immediate, but the commercial effects were, in some ways, even more remarkable. Opening day, $26.5 million, including $3 million from private church screenings on Monday and Tuesday. By Friday, the film was on nearly 4,800 screens. The 5-day total approached $125 million, matching The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, for the biggest Wednesday opening ever. It held the #1 spot for 3 consecutive weekends. By the end of its run, the domestic total was $370.8 million. The worldwide total exceeded $612 million, against a $30 million budget. It was, at the time, the highest grossing R-rated film in United States history. It remains the highest grossing independent film of all time. And there's this. The man who starred in it paid for it in ways that have nothing to do with money. So here's the real mystery at the center of all this, and it's one Gibson returned to on Rogan's podcast with something close to quiet fury, what the film did to Jim Caviezel. Gibson told Rogan that he had warned Caviezel before filming began. The warning was direct and unambiguous. "You'll never work in this town again," Gibson told him. Caviezel has confirmed this in multiple interviews over the years. He has said he took a day to pray before calling Gibson back and accepting the role, and then the filming nearly killed him. The physical toll is documented and extraordinary. Caviezel was accidentally whipped twice during the scourging scenes, leaving a 14-inch scar across his back. He dislocated his left shoulder carrying the cross. A cross weighing over 150 pounds fell on his head during filming, and he bit through his tongue. The blood visible on screen in the finished film is real. He contracted hypothermia and pneumonia from hanging nearly unclothed on the cross in the Italian winter, in -4-degree temperatures with 30-knot winds for weeks. He suffered severe migraines from the prosthetic makeup used to create a swollen eye, which impaired his depth perception. And he was struck by lightning, not once, twice. The first strike hit during filming of the Sermon on the Mount in Matera, setting his hair on fire. The second struck the assistant director, John Michelini, standing near him during a later scene. Caviezel described the lightning strikes publicly in a 2023 interview. They led, he said, to 2 heart surgeries, one of them open heart, and years of medication. The issue was not fully corrected until 2014, a decade after the film's release. Gibson told Rogan what this cost Caviezel beyond the physical. Caviezel has spoken publicly about being rejected by my own industry after the film. He went from being one of the most promising actors of his generation, The Thin Red Line, Frequency, The Count of Monte Cristo, to a career defined almost entirely by faith-based films and supporting roles. He has described the experience as a kind of professional exile. "All of a sudden, I stopped being one of 5 most popular actors in the studio," Caviezel told the Polish journalist Łukasz Adamski, "and I hadn't done anything wrong. I just played Jesus." That is not a fringe claim. It is what the career record shows. Gibson told Rogan that his own view of the Gospels had only deepened in the years since. He described the biblical accounts of Jesus as verifiable history. He pointed to the fate of the apostles as evidence. "Every single one of those guys died rather than deny their belief," he said. He described his own faith without qualification. "I was born into a Catholic family. I'm very Christian in my beliefs. I do actually believe this stuff to the full." And then he told Rogan about the sequel. The most extraordinary claim Gibson made on the podcast, the one that landed differently from everything else, was about what comes next, the resurrection of the Christ. He described the screenplay as something unprecedented. "It's an acid trip," he said. "I've never read anything like it." He explained that the story could not be told as a linear narrative. In order to really tell the story properly, you have to really start with the fall of the angels, which means you're in another place, you're in another realm. You need to go to hell, you need to go to Sheol. Gibson told Rogan that the script had been written over 7 years by Gibson, his brother Donald, and the screenwriter Randall Wallace. He described the scope as stretching from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. What he did not say, what he withheld, perhaps deliberately, was how far the project had already gone. Filming began in October 2025 at Rome's Cinecittà Studios. It wrapped in April 2026 after 134 days of shooting across Rome, Bari, Genosa, Krakow, Brindisi, and Matera. Jim Caviezel was not recast out of dispute. He was recast because the story takes place 3 days after the crucifixion, and Caviezel is now 57 years old. The role of Jesus went to Jaakko Otonen, a Finnish actor in his mid-30s. Lionsgate is distributing. Part 1 is set for May 6th, 2027, Ascension Day. Part 2 for May 25, 2028. Gibson told Rogan about the vision, but the machinery was already turning. Now, every one of these elements, The studio rejections, the pre-release condemnation, the financing, the physical cost, the career fallout, the 20-year silence followed by a podcast that pulled 13 million views, every one of them can be read individually as something less than extraordinary. Studios pass on risky projects every day. Advocacy groups criticize films they believe are harmful. Actors get hurt on set. Careers cool. But all of them together, pointing to the same story, documented across 2 decades, consistent across every account Gibson and Caviezel have given, that is a different kind of question. That is not one bad meeting. That is a pattern. And the pattern says something specific. It says that a film about the central event of the world's largest religion, directed by one of the most commercially successful filmmakers alive, could not find a single institutional home in the industry, built to sell stories to the largest possible audience. It says that the condemnation began before the film was finished. It says that the man who played Jesus was warned it would cost him his career, and it did. And it says that the film still made $600 million, because the audience was never the problem. Now step back and look at the full picture. A Best Director winner pitched a film about Jesus. 7 studios said no, he paid for it himself. The opposition started before anyone had seen it. A small distributor most people had never heard of took the gamble. Churches organized the rollout like a ground campaign. And the film opened on Ash Wednesday and became the highest-grossing R-rated film in American history. The lead actor was struck by lightning, scarred, hospitalized, and subsequently shut out of the industry. 20 years later, the director sat down on the biggest podcast on earth and told the whole story. And now the sequel is filmed, it's in post-production, and the release dates are locked. You do not have to agree with Gibson's theology. You do not have to share his interpretation of the Gospels. But the timeline is the timeline. And the doors that closed, and the ones that are opening now, tell a story that the industry has never fully reckoned with. Gibson told Rogan something else, quietly, near the end. He described the resurrection as the claim that requires the most faith and the most belief. He asked a simple question. Who gets back up 3 days later after he gets murdered in public? Buddha didn't do that. That is not an argument. That is a provocation. And whether it lands as conviction or as audacity depends entirely on what you already believe. But the film is coming. And this time, a major distributor said yes. If this story moved you, or troubled you, or made you rethink something you thought was settled, consider subscribing. We do not chase the algorithm here. We chase the part of the story that got left out of the headline. Drop a comment and tell me which detail in this one surprised you most. The 7 studios passing, the pre-release condemnation before anyone had seen the film, the lightning strikes, or the fact that it still made $600 million. I'd genuinely like to know. There are more of these. Stories where the official version and the actual sequence of events do not quite line up, and nobody noticed until somebody finally sat down and said it out loud. We are still working through them. I'll see you in the next one.